Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Youth Career Mentorship session. We hope that this series has helped you understand how our talents and passions can be directed to the service of our communities, what principles should guide our work in order for this purpose to be fulfilled, how our work can build unity across cultures and peoples, and how work done in a spirit of service to others can unlock human capacity and release our creative powers. The presenters in this series have achieved excellence in their field of work and have applied their knowledge and expertise to address different types of social injustices and to advance inclusion and equity at the local and global levels. We are honored to have with us this morning Professor Payam Akhavan, who is joining us from Montreal, Canada. Professor Akhavan was the first legal advisor to the prosecutor's office of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda at The Hague from 1994 to 2000, and in 2016 he was appointed a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. He has also served in the field with the UN in Bosnia, Croatia, Cambodia, Guatemala, Timor-Leste, and Rwanda. Professor Akhavan is a founder of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, prosecutor of the Iran People's Tribunal, a member of the United Kingdom Child Sexual Abuse People's Tribunal, and has contributed to the activities of numerous non-governmental organizations and grassroots survivors groups. Professor Akhavan teaches and researches at the McGill University on public international law, international dispute settlement, international criminal law, human rights, and cultural pluralism. He received the degree of Doctor of the Science of Jurisprudence from Harvard Law School, and prior to joining McGill, he was a senior fellow at Yale Law School. In 2017, he delivered the CBC Macy Lectures in Search of a Better World, the Human Rights Odyssey, which ran from September to October in 5 Canadian cities. His companion book was the #1 bestseller nonfiction in Canada. As Professor Akhavan goes through his presentation, I encourage you to type your questions in the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. We'll go through some of these questions in the second half of our session. Professor Akhavan, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much to you, Martha Jalali, for this kind invitation, and to all the youth that are joining this session today. I'm very honored to share with you some thoughts about my own journey in search of answers, in search of meaning and purpose, and how wonderful that you, at the prime of your youth, are giving careful thought to these questions, which will shape the rest of your life. And as I will explain, my story very much began in my own youth. And I will begin with a prayer that is on the tombstone of my wonderful grandmother, which says that in order to give forth its lights, a candle must burn. A candle must weep its life away. And I want you to think about that image, that the purpose of the candle is to burn. Without burning, it serves no useful purpose. It cannot give forth its light. So to live a life where you are a source of light to a world that sometimes feels and looks dark, you have to be willing to burn. And burning is about sacrifice. It's about overcoming ego, fear, mind imitation, superficial materialism, and all the things which distracts us from our deeper purpose and from our great potential to do good in the world. I was born in Tehran, Iran. I was a member of the Baha'i religious minority, which had been persecuted for many years in Iran. And when I left at the age of 9 to come to Canada, the country that I left behind, Iran went through a revolution, which was a quite violent revolution. And the members of my community, friends, family, people who we had so many memories with, were arrested. They were put in prison. Many were tortured. And this, of course, was a very sad and dark moment for my family and my community. But I think the one event in the summer of 1983 that really changed my life was what happened to a fellow 16-year-old by the name of Mona Mahmoud Nishad. And of course, I was a typical 16-year-old, an immigrant child, trying to fit in, trying to be cool, all the things that we worry about as adolescents. And then I heard that Mona, who was my age, had been arrested because she had written an essay in her high school on human rights, saying that I demand my freedom of conscience, my freedom of belief. And of course, in Iran, that would cost her her life. She was arrested, she was taken to prison. And in the summer of 1983, she and 9 other Baha'i women in the city of Shiraz were hanged. And when I received news of what had happened to Mona, it completely destroyed my world. And it made me realize that the only thing that separated me from her is that my family moved to Canada and hers stayed behind. That she died and I would get to live. And at that moment, I had to ask myself a question. What is my life worth if it is wasted on selfishness and mediocrity? And our world is surrounded by mediocrity. We have a materialistic culture, which is all about the ego. It's about your appearance and what you wear and how much money you have and how famous you are. And that world is an illusion. It is empty. It is entirely meaningless. And those of you who have the good fortune of understanding that now at the beginning of your life are in a far better position than those who wake up with their midlife crisis or at the end of the road in their old age and ask themselves, what did I stand for? What did I do with my life? And it was Mona's sacrifice that, in a sense, shocked me into asking that question. If she gave her life to create a better world, what is my freedom and liberty and opportunity worth here in North America if all I worry about is my superficial appearance and my ego and all the other nonsense that we are distracted with on a daily basis on social media and what have you? So I decided that I would commit my life to fighting for human rights. And I didn't choose a career in human rights. The career chose me. Because I think sometimes if we really search in the depth of our conscience, our career will come to us. We don't need to chase it. The best things that have happened to me have been those moments where it's almost like the heavens opened and they spoke to me and they said, this is your road, this is your journey. And I say this because it doesn't matter so much what you do for a career. You could be a doctor or a lawyer, or you could be a gardener, you could be a farmer, you could be a nurse, you could be a grocery clerk. It's completely irrelevant. What really matters is what is in your heart, what is in your conscience. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because we all have different gifts, different talents, different opportunities. But the fundamental choice we have to make is whether we want to be that candle that's giving light in the world, or whether we want to be self-absorbed and only thinking about our egotistic impulses and interests. So although I chose a career in human rights, I could have chosen any other career. That's not the point of this discussion. So I went to law school, and while my friends were on Wall Street making 6-digit salaries, getting really rich, I was a poor, starving human rights lawyer. And then a war broke out in this place called Yugoslavia at the time. And there were these horrible sights of injustice and suffering, of innocent civilians being killed, of towns being destroyed, of concentration camps. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, do we care about suffering in the world? It's a very basic question. Do we care? And if we don't care, well, then why are we having this conversation? And where there is apathy, there's always an excuse. Where there is empathy, there's always a solution. If you live your life out of love, compassion, and empathy, feeling the pain and suffering of others, you will always find a way to do good in the world. But if you're apathetic, if you're indifferent, if you don't care, you will always find an excuse to justify your inaction. It's as simple as that. And the suffering could be halfway across the world in Yugoslavia or Rwanda or what have you, or it could be around the corner. It could be your next door neighbor. It could be the next community over from your life of comfort and privilege. There are always opportunities to serve humankind if we want to, if we look for it, if we want to become entrepreneurs, if you like, humanitarian entrepreneurs. So I went to the war to try and investigate these horrible crimes. And I was working for the United Nations. My job was to investigate, to write reports, to let the world know, to bear witness to what would otherwise be a crime that would happen in a dark corner that nobody would ever hear about. So it was about speaking truth to justice, holding those that are committing these crimes accountable. And as a young man, idealistic, many people told me, "You're so naive. You don't understand the reality of the world. Powerful people do whatever they want. And you're just naive. You will know better. Once you get a bit older, a bit more experience, you'll become cynical just like us. And you will accept that powerful people can do whatever they want. And you just have to sit down and shut up and accept it." And I mention this because it's true. It's easy to be idealistic when you're youth. It's easy to be idealistic in the classroom when you've never paid a price for your beliefs. It's also easy to go out there in the world and to see disappointing things and to become cynical and disillusioned. It doesn't take any talent or any strength to become disappointed or disillusioned. So the moment that your beliefs become really important is when you go out there in the world and you see the face of those that suffer injustice. And you also see the indifference and corruption of the powerful, and you don't give up. That is when your values and your principles are really put to the test. And that made me think once again about Mona. I hope to God none of us will be faced with the choice that she had to face of choosing between her belief and her life. But every day and every moment of our life, we have choices to make. We can either turn our back to the light, we can turn our back to suffering and injustice, and what we can do to make the world a better place. Or we can turn around with courage and face that reality and roll up our sleeves and become involved. And it's very important to know that you will make many mistakes along the way. I can tell you about how many mistakes I made. We just don't have enough time. I made so many mistakes. I got hurt. I got disappointed. I got disillusioned. It was a long and difficult journey to be in the United Nations with all the politics, seeing the horrors of war and hatred on the one hand, and then the indifference of people in power who don't care as long as their interests are not affected. And then to try to make sense of it all, it was painful, it was very difficult. So I went from Yugoslavia to Rwanda, where in 1994, 1 million people were killed, and the world didn't lift a finger to help them. I went to Cambodia, to Guatemala, where I witnessed how in the name of progress, in the name of some great utopia, some of the greatest evils of our time have been committed. And the only thing that I'm proud of is not the list of accomplishments on my resume, and that is just an illusion. It's meaningless. You know, sometimes we have to play that game to get hired by an employer, and whatever the case may be. But the only thing that really matters to me is the conversation I have with my own soul in my own conscience. Because at the end of the day, your relationship with your own self is far more important than what others think about you. And when you have a kind of spiritual depth and you really reach deep within and you understand who you are, then you become immune from a lot of the weaknesses and fears and anxieties that we have because of our ego. Oh my goodness, what if I'm rejected? What if I don't make enough money and my friends don't respect me? And what if I don't look this way or that way? And within us is an immense power to be that candle, to bring light into this world. And it's a culture of materialism which makes us doubt our own capacity. A culture that says, unless you're a billionaire boss or some powerful politician or some Hollywood celebrity, you're a nobody. You don't matter. That is the biggest lie, because it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. The people that are driven by their egos are the ones that are living in an illusion. And those of us that are smart, and smart is not about going to the Ivy League universities or being a hedge fund manager making billions and all the other things. Being smart is understanding that, you know, life is this beautiful river. And at the end, all of those rivers are going to pour into an ocean. We're all one day going to draw our last breath. And there's something beautiful about that, because then we realize that the choices that we make are so important. Every day matters. Every moment matters. Every situation where you can choose between being a source of love, compassion, and justice towards others, or being selfish and indifferent. You're making a choice of great importance, and you're exercising your power to bring about change in the world. And real change in the world, I've learned, someone who worked in the United Nations, who's an international lawyer, I appear before the World Court in The Hague, and I do all of these things. And obviously, I think what I do has some value, otherwise I wouldn't do it. But I also realized that the real lasting change which comes about is less about whether this or that political party is in power, or if someone makes a beautiful speech at the United Nations. It's more about the daily transactions of life among people. It's about relations in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our schools and universities and places of work. That is where we, in an organic way, lay the seeds that over time bear fruit. And the most profound changes in history have always come from the bottom up. They've come from so-called ordinary people who say no to tyranny, injustice, indifference, greed, and materialism, and who decide to be that candle that gives light in the world. And I want to end by speaking about a bigger kind of historical picture of where we are today and the generation that you belong to. You know, when I was in university, there was no such thing as internet. There was no such thing as Zoom, which allows us to have this conversation just now. And there's no such thing as email, the World Wide Web. So why do I say this? Because we are going through extraordinary changes, and times of change are frightening. They're confusing because everything we've known is challenged. Now, you will witness in your lifetime extraordinary changes. The Industrial Revolution, which brought us modernity, took place over 150, 200 years, and it irreversibly changed the course of thousands of years of human history. Industrialization, science, technology, electricity, medicine, and so on and so forth. So imagine what has happened in the past 20 to 30 years with the internet revolution, how it is completely turned our world upside down. We live today in a world of infinite possibilities. We live in a world where to say that we're part of one global village is no longer some futuristic dream. It's the reality of the present. One would have to be a fool, and sadly, many people in power are just that, to think that catastrophic climate change, global warming, pandemics, or economic reality, migration, everything today transcends the boundaries and walls that we have created in our own mind. The reality of the world is that of inextricable interdependence. We are one body, and we cannot ignore the suffering of another part of that body. It's almost like saying, I don't care if I get the coronavirus in my left nostril because it's not going to affect the rest of my body. That would be utterly foolish. Well, the same thing applies to the reality of the world. I don't care about greed and materialism and injustice, and I'm just going to build a wall and hide behind it and ignore the rest of the world. We just don't have that choice. It's no longer just a question of morality and doing the right thing. It's a question of being realistic. And I say this because time is on the side of those that view the world as one reality. Time is on the side of those that embrace the oneness of humankind, that understand that our happiness and purpose comes from understanding our noble spiritual nature rather than thinking of ourselves as greedy, materialistic creatures. So I would say that you should not be deterred by all the naysayers, by all the negativity, all the cynicism, and you should, with complete confidence and conviction, dedicate your life, your career, your learning to serving humankind, and ask yourself every day, am I giving light in the world, or am I not? So I'm going to stop there and thank you once again for your patience. And it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you. So I will pass it back to Martha.
Professor Akhavan, thank you so much. Really, I was trying to hold back my tears. This is so inspiring, so powerful. I invite the friends to type your questions in the question and answer box that you have at the bottom of your screen. We have some questions arriving. So a question is, what is your take on the universalism of human rights and cultural relativism? How do you theoretically and practically bridge them? No, I must say that we have several students from graduate programs in peace studies and conflict resolution also joining us.
Ah, that's a very good university level question. And I'm not also aware of the diversity in the audience and the levels that people get in their studies. I won't give you a 1 hour lecture. It's dangerous to ask a professor a question because he will never stop talking. But I would say that on the one hand, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted by the UN in 1948 reflects in some respects the Western constitutional tradition, the Virginia Bill of Rights, the French Declaration on the Rights of Man, although we should remember that even in the Western liberal tradition, women were not allowed to vote. We had slave societies. We were exterminating indigenous people. So the idea that human rights or universal human rights are rooted in Western civilization alone isn't exactly accurate historically. So the other point is that some of the underlying ideas of human rights are found in many other cultures and civilizations. In fact, the drafters of the US Constitution, Benjamin Franklin and the like, were inspired by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, who in 450 BC had this so-called Cyrus cylinder, which was a a clay cylinder on which Cyrus issued an edict giving all the subjects of his empire religious freedom. And you will even read about it in the Old Testament, where Cyrus liberated the Jews, let them return to Jerusalem to build the temple. So Xenophon, the Greek writer, wrote about Cyrus, and the drafters of the US Constitution were inspired by that example. So the other point is that it took the horrors of the Holocaust to force the creation of the United Nations and the universalization of human rights. So one could say that, well, yes, maybe human rights are a Western concept, but the Western civilization has also given rise to the worst atrocities in history. So I think that we have to look at the relationship between culture and human rights in a much more complex fashion, and also realize that we're part of a historical evolution. Cultures are not fossils in a museum. Cultures are constantly evolving, and even if a cultural idea emerged from one part of the world, well, it is embraced and adapted differently in different contexts. And I would end by saying one thing. It's one thing to talk about human rights. It's another thing to talk about the sort of consumerist culture, which at present the Western civilization is exporting throughout the world, and which is bringing us to the brink of not just climate catastrophe, but also economic disaster. So the individualistic idea of human rights, which does not recognize the importance of social solidarity and communal relations, I think is coming to an end. And if anything, the pandemic is teaching us in a very powerful way that human rights and a just society is much more than individual autonomy and the belief that we are at the center of the universe, the bearer of rights, and that the whole universe owes us those rights as a matter of obligation. That human rights is more fundamentally about human dignity. And I think that we have not seen the end of our idea of human rights as we evolve historically and have ever new and different conceptions.
Thank you so much, Professor Akhavan. Again, I want to remind the friends to type your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And we have a chat box, but the advantage of the question and answer box is that I can share then your questions later on with everyone. So another question we have is, other speakers have mentioned that as you have mentioned also, that somehow their careers found them and not the other way around. How does one trust in destiny and leave himself or herself open to receive this type of inspiration?
It's a wonderful question, and one which is very difficult to answer. So I'm not saying that we should just leave everything to fate. Not at all. I think we have agency, we have choices to make, and I think I made that very clear. You need to think, you need to reflect, you need to make decisions, and you need to follow through on them. But you should also be prepared to make mistakes, to be disappointed, and to go back and retrace your steps and adjust your journey on that path. So the question of fate is a very difficult one to answer, because there are things in life that we control and things that we do not. And where the boundary lies between the two, I cannot tell you. All I'm saying is that we live in a very materialistic, utilitarian world. We're kind of very neurotic. We want to control all aspects of our life. And that's not the way life is. We are a drop in an infinite ocean. We're an insignificant speck in an infinite universe. And there's something beautiful and liberating about that, because we're constantly living in anxiety, saying, oh my God, there's so much uncertainty. What's going to happen tomorrow? Just let go, surrender, and enjoy the beauty of the journey. So it's in a sense about having faith in yourself and in life, that the most wonderful things in life are the ones that we least expect. And I've seen that happen again and again. And I'm a skeptical person. I'm not, naive, idealistic person, but I've seen time and again that in the moments where I have fought with the universe and retreated in my ego, I have always lost. And in the moments where I have, fallen on my knees, where my whole world has fallen apart, and I surrender, all of a sudden, as I said, the clouds open and this ray of light comes down. So I can't tell you specifically how to develop that sense of intuition. I would call it intuition. We have lost our sense of intuition in our modern materialistic culture, where everything has either a theoretical answer or a technocratic answer. And even in the academy, we are taught that knowledge is all about the intellect. Well, knowledge is in part about the intellect, but the most fundamental knowledge is about our intuition. Let's go to the question of human rights. Is human rights a scientific reality? Absolutely not. If you look at history, most of history is about war, genocide, slavery, racism. History is absolutely brutal. So the idea of human rights is an article of faith. It's our belief in the nobility of human beings. Why do you get outraged at injustice? Is there some intellectual reality to injustice? Absolutely not. It begins from our earliest formative experience as children in the schoolyard when we see someone getting bullied, all the way to our lives as adults when we see injustice in politics or in our place of work or what have you. So you need to work on developing your intuition, your inner self, your spiritual reality, and understand that that is also a form of knowledge. Just as without literacy, you can't read and write. And we can't even imagine what it's like not to be able to read or write, but there are a lot of people that are illiterate, they cannot read or write. So if you do not develop your intuition and your spiritual faculties, you cannot read the signs, if you like, along the road of life, which point you in this or that direction. And you will get to the fork in the road and you'll be lost. You won't know which way to go. But don't be afraid of making mistakes. Try to reach deep within your soul. Do the best that you can. Make the right choice as best as you can then. And be prepared to be disappointed, to make mistakes. And it's not always, either black or white. It's always going to be, a mixture of many different things. And as you have more and more experiences, if you are open and receptive to learning life's lessons, instead of becoming cynical and disappointed, you will begin to see things more and more clearly. And that's the most empowering thing that can happen.
Another question, how does one learn to turn ideals and passions into elements of function so that one or one's voice can survive to contribute to progress in issues of human rights when there are clear and dangerous barriers to expression?
Well, these are very good questions, but they're very complex and they depend so much on circumstances. I think, having said all that I said about purity of motives, if you like, and having that sort of deeper self-reflection and making decisions from your heart and soul, we also need to be strategic. We also need to be smart about understanding how to engage with the reality of the world in order to move things in the right direction. So it's very easy to condemn the world and to say, look, it's all evil, it's all horrible, and all of that. But we have to understand how the world functions. We have to understand everything from our economic systems, our social structures, our political institutions. So we need to engage with the real world rather than escaping because it's just too complicated and too difficult. But in engaging with the world, whether it's through your education, through your career, or simply through life experience, we need to make sure that we do not become consumed by it, that we do not forget why we engage in the first place. How many times do we hear about people saying, I entered politics because I had ideals and I wanted to do good in the world. And then 10 years later, you hear a very different narrative of someone who's become completely consumed by the same corruption that they wanted to go and fight. So it's very important to be strategic, to know how to engage, let's say in my case, with the United Nations system, with the International Court of Justice. How do you go and persuade judges to interpret the law one way or the other? How do you influence decision makers, give them the right incentives to do something that is positive and progressive? So your knowledge matters. Your kind of intellectual knowledge, your professional experience is very important in making you an even more effective tool for change.
There are two questions that are related, Professor Akhavan, is how do you manage to be surrounded by politicians while keeping your faith, and I will add your faith in humanity? And do you think the world is becoming a better place? And how do you avoid becoming disillusioned?
The very good questions. I would begin by saying that corruption does not belong to politicians alone. There's corruption everywhere, but our political institutions have especially become corrupt. And the more that you have concentrations of power and wealth, and you create an egotistic culture, the more likely that you're likely to have that kind of corruption. And it's really interesting when we think about the professions, politics, business, law, the highest paid professions are the ones that do not reward empathy. You're not rewarded for empathy in the world of business or politics or law or whatever. On the contrary, you're rewarded for being manipulative, selfish. And then when you look at teachers and nurses and the professions that involve empathy and genuine human bonds, you see that they tend to be the lowest paid and least rewarded professions. That says something about our culture, doesn't it? That we are giving hedge fund managers billions of dollars, but those that are the educators of our children in schools have to work 2 or 3 extra jobs to make ends meet. So those are some of the aspects of understanding how one can live in a world in which there is corruption, whether it comes from politics or business or whatever, and realizing that unless you have integrity, and integrity isn't something that you order on Amazon. Integrity is something you develop over a lifetime of effort. And just like you cannot just, wave a magic wand and become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or what have you, you also cannot do the same with integrity. Integrity requires education. It requires discipline and effort and practice. And unless you have integrity, a deep spiritual self-consciousness, then you are going to be consumed by all the corruption that you're surrounded with. What was it Oscar Wilde said? I can resist everything but temptation. So in a sense, the temptation is always there to take the easy way out, to go after the ego, the money, the power, and integrity requires tremendous strength of character. It's much easier to be the self-serving coward. And we need, once again, to transform our culture from the bottom up and ask ourselves, why is it that we reward bad behavior in our political structures and economic systems? And we reward the people that don't pay taxes. We reward the people that manipulate the laws and regulations in their own favor. We have, the CEOs of major corporations that we see as great heroes, as brilliant minds, and then we realize that their workers' minimum wage is so low that they can barely feed their families. Should these people be our role models, or are they people that are really part of the problem? So you have to always be asking questions, not to become paralyzed with cynicism of the world, but to realize that the way things appear isn't necessarily the way things are. And if you have that self-critical approach together with a deep sense of integrity, that will shield you from being tempted by the wrong things as you move forward in your life and career.
That's right, Akhavan. In a practical sense, what can us ordinary citizens, what can we ordinary citizens do to advance the cause of human rights? Um, you mentioned the importance of engaging with our society. What are some practical steps that we can take?
Mhm, mhm. It's a good question, and there are so many answers to that that I don't even know where to begin. You know, I'll share a story. You know, in Canada, we have a history of racism against indigenous peoples who suffered from colonialism and injustice, and who still suffer from the consequences of those injustices. So we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which looked at Indigenous residential schools. And I know that there is this practice also in the United States and in Australia and a lot of other countries where Indigenous children were forcibly taken away from their parents and sent to Christian schools to basically become civilized, you know, and this was, of course, deeply traumatic. Imagine 6-year-old being ripped away from the arm of her mother, going to a school where she's told her identity, her culture is evil, where she's punished for speaking her language and forced to speak English. And then there were a history of abuse and poor sanitation and poor nutrition. And so these generation upon generation suffer terribly. And in some years ago, the Prime Minister of Canada issued an apology in our parliament to the Indigenous people of Canada. And one of my friends in the city of Winnipeg, in Manitoba, in Canada, received a knock on his door. And he was actually a child who was sent to the residential schools, who has very deep wounds from that experience. And at his doorstep were an elderly immigrant couple who couldn't even speak English that well. And they had a plate of muffins. And they offered it to him. They said, "We're so sorry to hear what your people went through, that we want to share with you this plate of muffins as a gesture of friendship." And my friend recounts that story with tears in his eyes. And he says, "It touched me so deeply that I will never forget it." So sometimes a simple act of kindness has so much power in confirming the dignity of fellow human beings. So if we look around us in society, we have anxiety, we have depression, we have emptiness, we have poverty, we have racism, misogyny, injustice. There's so much out there that we can do. And sometimes it begins with that simple act of kindness, knocking on your neighbor's door and trying to understand where they come from, what they have suffered. And I want to also say one thing. It's really funny that we obviously talk about poverty, people who are poor, and maybe we want to volunteer in a soup kitchen to help the homeless, and that's understandable. But the rich suffer too. And this is ironic that we live in a society of unprecedented prosperity, but we are going through a mental health crisis of unparalleled proportion. I work most of the time in poor countries, and I don't see the incidence of anxiety and depression and stress that I see in North America, where half of our population are medicated in order to be able to live. So there is also a pain which comes from emptiness, where you have everything you need. You have a beautiful car, a beautiful home, wonderful vacations, and you have everything. And you wake up one day and you say, "What is my life all about? I feel empty." Which is why I wanted to say how wonderful it is that you're asking these questions at the beginning of your life, and not when you've blindly imitated these ideas of what success is, only to wake up in your mid-age and say, "So what? I'm at the peak of my career. I have everything that I'm supposed to have. Everyone thinks I'm Mr. Big Shot or very important. And I feel completely empty." And one of the experiences that I've had has been to reach out to those people as well at the right moments and introduce them to the beauty of serving humankind. And I've seen people who were fantastically wealthy give it all up. And I'm not saying by give it all up, that they throw it away, but they in their emptiness experience how beautiful it is to give of yourself to others. And they can never go back to the life that they had before because they realized it was a waste of their time. So our idea of touching others isn't just about social injustice and poverty and racism. Those are very important, but it's also awakening the rich and powerful to how beautiful it is to actually use that wealth and power in a spirit of service and to give meaning to your life.
Thank you, Professor Akhavan. What recommendation would you make to a youth who wants to be active in the human rights field?
Human rights means many different things. We have civil and political rights, which relate to issues of equality between men and women, racial equality, freedom of expression, prohibition of torture, the rights of migrants, migrant children. There are many areas in which one could be active in very different kinds of professions. One could be a psychotherapist, one could be a social worker, one could be a lawyer, one could be a business entrepreneur, and you could run your business with a different idea of what profit means and what it means to collaborate and to share the wealth with others. So I think human rights also includes economic and social rights. We should also realize that we have been conditioned by this idea that your right to food and healthcare and education, that's not a human right. It's only your freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Well, what good is freedom of expression if you die of COVID-19 because you can't afford medical care? That's an injustice. And that also is part of the idea of human rights, both as a matter of international law, but also as a matter of common sense in terms of what human dignity means. So I think all of us should be speaking out and struggling for a society in which every human being has adequate medical care, adequate food, in which teachers get paid adequate salaries so that our children have proper education, childcare for parents who have to work. These very basic issues over one generation can completely change our society. Imagine a society in which every child has a good, decent education, a society in which people don't have to work 70 hours a week in order to put food on the table. For God's sake, in our fabulously wealthy societies, we have millions of children that go to bed hungry. It is shocking. UNICEF, I believe in 2014, did a study that 32% of children in the United States live under the poverty line. They don't have enough to eat. That is just completely unacceptable. And your generation has to send the message that you will not accept that. It's completely unacceptable that the richest 10 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity. So 3.5 billion people have less wealth than the top 10 people. What do those 10 people want to do with that wealth? So it's really important to be aware of your world and to become engaged. And there are many different ways to become engaged. So that is how you can become involved in human rights in 100 different ways.
And then one last question, or also we can take another one. Do you think this pandemic has awakened humanity to the reality of our oneness? And if so, how do we keep our fellow human beings from forgetting this reality after the pandemic passes?
It's a very good question. And it's really remarkable when you think about the world before the pandemic. Most of you probably don't even remember the world before the pandemic because this abrupt change has come. And now we are all speaking over Zoom and working by Zoom and social distancing. And so why do I say this? Because imagine it's just the smallest particle in the universe. A virus, a microscopic particle, has completely changed our world, turned our world upside down. And it is very humbling to realize that no matter how advanced we are scientifically and technologically or what have you, one little virus can completely disrupt the world. And of course, there's still a long way to go because of the economic aftershock, which is yet to be fully experienced. And sometimes things need to unravel in chaos before we can reimagine them and rebuild the world, which is why you live in such an exciting time. It may be a frightening time because there is a lot of turbulence and instability ahead, I can assure you. But this is also an incredible opportunity to reimagine the world. So getting back to your question about the pandemic, like climate change, like so many other things, teaches us that all of these borders that we have created in our minds are meaningless. They mean absolutely nothing. Global warming, pandemics, and what have you, don't have a nationality. They don't go through the immigration formalities at the border. And the reality is that of our biological oneness, that of the oneness of the universe, and getting back to the indigenous peoples and their ancient wisdom. It's remarkable to see how they have this understanding of our place in the universe, our relationship to nature. They understand that we are not at the center of the universe. We're just part of nature. We're part of creation. And the world can go on with or without us. It's really incredible when you think about it. If all insects became extinct, life would vanish on Earth. But if humankind became extinct, life would flourish. Think about that. Think about that. We need to be humble. And we need to understand that the earth isn't there to serve our needs, that we have a duty, we also have an obligation towards creation. And in a sense, as a law professor, I've been recently researching ancient wisdom and law, and my indigenous colleagues or scholars say that the source of law is Mother Earth. Mother Earth gives us the law, and it doesn't matter what we think. It doesn't matter if we disagree with Mother Earth because she will always win in the end. So we live in a culture of toxic arrogance, of greed, of narcissism. We want to consume. We don't care about anyone or anything. And spiritualization is now a matter of survival. It's not about going to a yoga retreat in order to feel good about yourself. It's about if we don't spiritualize our civilization, we will self-destruct. Arnold Toynbee famously said, civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide. We are walking over the cliff. We are sleepwalking over the cliff. And that's why your generation has to change things dramatically. And what is wonderful is that we now have a world where through the remarkable innovations in technology, we could have a 2 or 3 day working week, consume far less, live far better lives with far greater justice and happiness in harmony with nature. Why don't we do that? It's utterly foolish not to do that. So that's why I'm saying that it's not just a question of doing good to your next door neighbor and having that sense of community, but it's also having that historical vision that we live in an era of extraordinary change. And that history is on the side of those that want to reimagine things rather than continuing business as usual.
Outstanding presentation, Professor Akhavan. Really, what an honor for me, I'm sure for all of us. I keep receiving thank you notes, and, thanking you for this, for your time, for your knowledge. And Professor Akhavan, one last question. A friend asked, any favorite authors or poet?
I love the Oriental mystics. I love the poetry of Rumi, which you can find easily online. I love the Lebanese writer Khalil Gibran, Gibran. And I'm also a Baha'i, so I love the Baha'i writings. They're so beautiful. One of them is called The Hidden Words, which has so many beautiful nuggets of wisdom. So I wish you all the best, and it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Professor Akhavan. Again, thank you, friends, for participating today. And our next presentation is going to be on May 30th. Mr. Todd Hossein is going to talk about building sustainable, building economies for social and environmental justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.